1992, Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee. The county sheriff kicks open the door of what locals call the sanctuary, a sprawling compound hidden behind 12-foot walls in the remotest corner of Monroe County. Inside, he finds 7 women. The oldest is 54, but she looks 80. She hasn't seen the outside world in 36 years. She was brought here as a bride at 18. Since then, she hasn't passed through the gate even once. This isn't a prison or a psychiatric hospital. This is a home where women were held captive in the name of divine purity. How did an entire family manage to hide living people for 36 years? Why didn't anyone notice that brides were disappearing forever? And what broke the silence after nearly 4 decades? If you're loving the content, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss us in your recommendations. We upload new, exciting videos every day. Thank you for watching. Let's get into it. April 1956. The hollers of eastern Tennessee held secrets better than anywhere else in America. Tucked into a valley where 3 mountains met, accessible only by a single dirt road that washed out every spring, sat the Coldwell compound. Locals called it the sanctuary, though few had ever been inside. The family kept to themselves, following what their patriarch, Josiah Coldwell, claimed were the original teachings, a blend of fundamentalist Christianity and his own interpretations that grew stranger with each passing year. Josiah was 39 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of presence that made people step back without knowing why. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was seeing straight through to your sins. He'd returned from Korea different. Everyone said so. Before the war, he'd been just another mountain boy. After, he'd come back with a mission. God spoke to me in that hell, he told anyone who'd listen. Showed me the corruption spreading through America. Women leaving their homes, abandoning their natural roles. Television bringing filth into every living room. The world's ending, and only the pure will survive. His wife Martha bore him 4 sons, Ezekiel, Tobias, Silas, and Micah. When the eldest turned 21, Josiah gathered them in the main hall of the compound, a massive log structure he'd built with his own hands. "A wife's place is in the home," he declared, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn walls. "Not in the world, not in the workplace, not on the streets. The home is her kingdom, her protection. Our women will live here, behind these walls, and they'll be blessed for it, safe from the corruption out there." Martha said nothing. She'd learned years ago that contradicting Josiah was pointless. The boys nodded. They'd grown up under their father's absolute authority. His word was law, backed up by the Bible and his fists. The first bride came in the summer of 1956. Her name was Leora Finch, 18 years old, orphaned at 12 and living with an aunt who didn't want her. The Coldwells found her through their church network, a loose affiliation of fundamentalist congregations scattered across Appalachia. When the matchmakers came calling with tales of a wealthy, God-fearing family and a handsome young husband, Leora's aunt practically pushed her out the door. Leora didn't resist. She thought she was getting a better life. The wedding was small, conducted by Josiah himself, who'd declared himself ordained by God. Leora wore a modest white dress that covered her from neck to ankle, her auburn hair pulled back severely. Ezekiel, 21, with his father's pale eyes and angular face, barely looked at her during the ceremony. After the vows, they drove her to the sanctuary. She walked through the compound gates with hope in her heart. She didn't know she'd never walk through them again. For the first few weeks, Leora thought she'd simply married into an unusually strict family. Martha showed her around, the kitchen, the sewing room, the garden within the walls, the cellars where they kept their provisions. "We're self-sufficient here," Martha explained in her flat, emotionless voice. "Everything we need is inside. The men handle the outside world. That's not for us." When Leora asked if she could go to town to buy fabric, Martha's face closed like a door. We don't leave the sanctuary. Josiah provides everything we need. The world out there is full of sin. We're protected here. 3 months after her wedding, Leora understood she was in a cage. When she tried to walk toward the gate one afternoon, Ezekiel caught her arm. Where do you think you're going? His voice was calm, which made it worse. Just to get some air, see what's beyond the... You get air in the garden. That's enough. There was no anger in his tone, just absolute finality. When Leora protested, said she wanted to see people, maybe write to her aunt, Ezekiel called his father. Josiah sat her down in the main hall. You're a Coldwell now, he said, those colorless eyes boring into her. This family has been chosen by God to preserve purity in a world gone mad. Women are the vessels of that purity, but only when protected. Out there, he gestured toward the walls, there's nothing but corruption. Men who would defile you with their eyes, media that would poison your mind, a culture that would strip away your natural modesty and turn you into a whore. Here, you're safe. Here, you're clean. Here, you fulfill God's purpose, to bear children, keep the home, and pray. Everything else is vanity and sin. He didn't shout. That made it more terrifying. He spoke like a preacher delivering a sermon with absolute conviction. Leora tried to escape twice. The first time, she waited until everyone slept, crept downstairs, and tried the back door. It was unlocked, but the compound gate was chained and padlocked with industrial hardware. She tried to climb the wall, but it was smooth concrete topped with metal spikes. She ripped her hands bloody trying. They found her, at dawn, huddled by the gate, sobbing. Josiah didn't beat her. He did something worse. He locked her in the root cellar, a dirt-floored room beneath the main house, completely dark, cold even in summer. She stayed there for 5 days with only water and bread once a day. You'll pray, he told her as he closed the heavy door. You'll ask God to forgive your pride and rebellion. When they let her out, Leora was broken. Ezekiel held her, stroked her hair. Don't fight it, he whispered. This is how it's supposed to be. You'll be happy here, you'll see. He genuinely believed it. In 1957, Leora gave birth to her first child. Martha delivered the baby, no doctor, no hospital. Women have been birthing babies since Eve, Josiah declared. Hospitals are just another way for the government to track and control you. The boy was healthy. Leora named him Samuel. She held him and wept for the joy of motherhood and the horror that her son would grow up in this prison. But gradually the baby consumed her. She stopped thinking about escape. She became part of the sanctuary. In 1958, Josiah arranged a marriage for his second son, Tobias. The bride was Delphine Hargrove, 19, from a Pentecostal community in Kentucky. Thin, blonde, with frightened blue eyes. She came to the sanctuary with hope that died within a month. Delphine fought. She screamed, clawed at the walls, refused to eat. They put her in the cellar again and again. She tried to escape 5 times. The last attempt ended when she jumped from a second-story window and shattered her ankle. A veterinarian from the nearest town, 30 miles away, came to set it. He walked in, did his work in silence, and left. Mountain people knew not to ask questions. After the break, Delphine stopped fighting. She didn't accept it, she just died inside. She moved through the compound like a ghost, stared at the walls with empty eyes. In 1960, Delphine gave birth to a daughter. The baby lived 4 days. Delphine wouldn't nurse her, wouldn't hold her. The infant died of dehydration. Josiah buried the tiny body in the compound's garden. No death certificate, no questions. In 1961, Delphine died, officially from pneumonia, actually from despair. She stopped eating, stopped drinking, simply faded away. Tobias found her cold in bed one morning. She was 22 years old. She'd spent 3 years in the sanctuary. Josiah buried her next to the infant. When neighbors asked about Tobias's wife, they said she'd died of illness. No one investigated. The Coldwells were strange, sure, but they minded their own business. That was valued in these mountains. That same year, Josiah found another bride for Tobias, Willa Prescott, 20, from an isolated community in West Virginia. An orphan like the others. Josiah chose carefully. Girls with no family to search for them, no one to ask questions. Willa was quiet, submissive. She accepted the rules with minimal resistance. Maybe Leora warned her about Delphine's fate. Maybe life had already beaten her down. She bore 3 children over 8 years, raised them in silence. She didn't try to escape. She simply existed, like a plant in a pot that would never see the forest. In 1962, they married the 3rd son, Silas. His bride was Nadine Kilpatrick, 18, from rural Georgia. Dark hair, dark eyes, sturdy build. The sanctuary was becoming crowded with captive women, 4 of them now: Martha, Leora, Willa, Nadine. They lived in the women's quarters, cooked, cleaned, raised children. They never passed through the gate. The men went to town, did business, interacted with the world. The women stayed inside. Always. Martha died in 1966 of a stroke. She was 51. Quiet and obedient, she'd lived in the sanctuary for 26 years without once challenging Josiah's rules. Maybe she'd been his first prisoner. Maybe this had all started with her. But no one talked about that. After her death, Leora became the senior wife. She was 30 years old and had been captive for 10 years. She could barely remember what the outside world looked like. Her skin had become pale, almost translucent. She saw sunlight only through windows. The children grew up thinking this was normal. "Mama can't go outside," Ezekiel explained to his son Samuel. "The world's too dangerous for her. She's protected here." Samuel accepted this without question. The daughters learned the same. Girls could play in the garden, but never beyond the walls. "When you grow up and marry, you'll live in your husband's home," Leora taught her daughter. "That's a woman's place." In 1968, Nadine died in childbirth. The baby was breech. Nadine screamed for 2 days. Leora and Willa tried to help, but didn't know how. Josiah refused to call a doctor. "God will decide," he said. Nadine bled to death. The baby died with her. She was 24 years old, had lived in the sanctuary for 6 years. They buried her in the garden next to Delphine. No one in the county questioned it. The Coldwells were weird, everyone knew that. Religious fanatics. But they kept to themselves, caused no trouble. Josiah had money, some said from bootlegging during Prohibition. Others whispered about marijuana crops hidden in the mountains. Money bought silence. When the Coldwells said a wife had died in childbirth, people nodded sympathetically and moved on. Mountain women died in childbirth sometimes. It happened. In 1969, Silas remarried. The 4th bride was Temperance Lyle, 20, from Tennessee's Cumberland Plateau. Tall, big-boned, with long brown hair, Temperance lasted longer than the others. She didn't rebel, didn't try to escape. She accepted her fate with the resignation of a sacrificial lamb. She bore 4 children over 10 years, prayed constantly, worked until her hands bled. She burned out from the inside, but kept functioning. By the early 1970s, 3 women lived in the sanctuary. Leora, 36 years old, 16 years captive. Willa, 32 years old, 12 years captive. Temperance, 23 years old, 4 years captive. The oldest children were teenagers. They'd grown up in this system and thought it was normal. One of those children was Samuel, Ezekiel and Leora's son. He turned 17 in 1973. He was built like his grandfather with the same pale, penetrating eyes. He helped his father with work, went to town occasionally, saw other people. He noticed that women out there walked freely, worked jobs, laughed. Sometimes he wondered why his mother never left the compound. But Grandfather Josiah explained. Tradition, boy. Purity. Our women aren't like those corrupt women out there. They're protected. Samuel nodded. He didn't know anything else. In 1974, Ezekiel arranged a marriage for his oldest son, the fifth bride, Ivy Dunbar, 19. In 1976, Samuel's turn came. He was 22, and Josiah insisted. They found a bride, Opal Hendricks, 18, through the church network. Another orphan, skinny and terrified. The wedding happened. Opal became the sixth captive woman in the sanctuary. Leora watched the new bride and saw herself at 18. She wanted to warn her, to say, "Run while you can." But she stayed silent. What could she say? She hadn't run. She'd accepted this life. She'd borne a son who now imprisoned his own wife just as his father had imprisoned her. By the late 1970s, 7 women lived behind the walls. The younger generation knew no other way. Captive women were simply normal to them. Josiah aged. By 1980, he was 63, his hair and beard completely white, but his eyes retained that terrible certainty. He saw that his system worked. The family was strong, the children grew up pure, the women were protected. No one questioned him. His sons followed his example, his grandsons too. The sanctuary stood like a fortress against the corrupting modern world. But there was a crack in the fortress. One grandson, Caleb, son of Silas and Nadine, who'd died in childbirth, was different. Quiet and thoughtful, he read voraciously, books his father brought from the county library. He read about other lives, about freedom, about love. Something in him resisted the doctrine. When he was 11, he asked his stepmother, Temperance, "Why don't you ever go outside?" She looked at him for a long time, and something terrible flashed in her eyes. Pain she'd hidden for years. "It's the way we do things here, honey. Don't you want to leave?" She turned away. Wanting doesn't matter. That was the first time anyone admitted it. Caleb grew up troubled by questions. He looked at his stepmother, at the other women, at Leora, who was approaching 50, and saw their pallor, their bent backs, their dead eyes. They were like plants in a basement, starved of light. When he was 16, he confronted his father. "Dad, why can't the women leave? Other women go outside, they have jobs, friends." Silas cut him off. "That's not how we do things. You'll understand when you're older, when you marry." "I don't want to live like this," Caleb said. Silas hit him for the first time in his life. "Don't you dare shame this family." In 1987, they brought in the last bride, Vera Talbot, 20, for one of the younger grandsons, the 7th woman in 31 years. In the fall of 1988, Caleb left the sanctuary. Not for the army, he wasn't the military type. He simply left, packed a bag one night and walked out. 30 miles to the nearest town, then a bus to Knoxville. He was 18 and finally free. The city was overwhelming. For weeks, Caleb could barely function. He'd grown up in isolation, homeschooled, interacting only with family. But slowly he adapted. He got a job in a bookstore, rented a room, started community college. He made friends, real friends, not just family. He met girls who walked freely, who had dreams and opinions. And he couldn't stop thinking about the women behind the walls. For 2 years, he tried to convince himself it wasn't his problem. He'd escaped. That should be enough. But the guilt gnawed at him. His mother had died giving birth to him. His stepmother had raised him with what little love she could spare. Leora, grandmother Leora, had told him stories when he was small, had smiled at him even as her light faded. They were still there, still trapped. In June 1990, Caleb walked into the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. The deputy on duty looked at the skinny kid with the haunted eyes and said, "Can I help you?" "I need to report a crime," Caleb said quietly. "Multiple crimes. Kidnapping. False imprisonment. It's been going on for 34 years. The deputy put down his coffee. "Say that again?" Sheriff Roy Brennan was 56, a Vietnam vet who'd seen things that gave him nightmares. But what Caleb told him that afternoon made his blood run cold. "You're saying 7 women are being held prisoner? For decades? In Tennessee?" "Yes, sir. At a place called the Sanctuary, the Coldwell compound, in the Eastern Hollers." Caleb's voice shook. "The oldest woman has been there since 1956. She was 18 when they took her. She's 52 now. She hasn't seen the outside world in 34 years. Brennan stared at him. "Son, that can't be right. Someone would have noticed, reported it." "No one noticed because no one looked. The Coldwells live isolated. The brides came from far away, orphans with no one to search for them, and..." Caleb swallowed hard. 2 women died there. Maybe more. They're buried in the garden. Brennan made some calls, to the state police, to the FBI. By the next morning, a task force was assembled. Federal kidnapping charges meant FBI involvement. They prepared carefully, got warrants, researched the property, studied maps. The Coldwell compound was a fortress. They needed to go in with overwhelming force. They came at dawn on a Tuesday in July 1990. 8 sheriff's deputies, 6 state troopers, 4 FBI agents. They drove 3 SUVs and a van up the washed-out dirt road parked 100 yards from the compound gates. Sheriff Brennan used a megaphone. "This is the Monroe County Sheriff. We have warrants for the arrest of Josiah Coldwell and others. Open the gate or we're coming through it." Silence. Then Ezekiel appeared at the gate. "You have no authority here. This is private property and a house of God." His voice was his father's voice, calm, certain, fanatical. "We have warrants issued by a judge," Brennan shouted back. "Federal warrants for kidnapping and false imprisonment. Open this gate now or we'll breach it." "You'll have to," Ezekiel said, and walked away. They used a battering ram on the gate. It took 20 minutes to break through the chains. When they finally entered the compound, Josiah was waiting in the main hall, surrounded by his sons and grandsons. 14 men, ranging from 73 to 20. Some had shotguns. "Put the weapons down," Brennan ordered. "Now!" Josiah stood slowly. He looked ancient, his white beard reaching his chest, but his pale eyes still burned. "You have no right to enter this sanctuary. We follow God's law, not man's corrupt." "You're under arrest," Brennan interrupted. "All of you, for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy." "Where are the women?" "In their quarters," Josiah said calmly. "Where they belong. Where they're safe." "Safe?" Brennan felt rage building. "Show us, now!" They led the officers through the compound. The women's quarters were in the back section, a series of rooms that hadn't been renovated since the 1950s. Dark, stuffy, furnished with cast-off furniture. 7 women sat on benches, their hands folded. They looked up when the door opened, and Brennan had to force himself not to react. They were ghosts. That was the only word. Pale as death itself, their skin almost translucent with a grayish tinge, the skin of people who'd lived in darkness for years. They were thin, bent over as if carrying invisible weights. The oldest, Leora, looked 90, though she was only 52. Her hair was pure white, her face a maze of premature wrinkles, her eyes filmed over with cataracts from lack of sunlight. "Ma'am," Brennan said gently to Leora, "when was the last time you left this building?" She looked at him. Actually looked at him, which clearly took effort. "August 1956, 34 years ago." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Did you want to leave?" A long pause. "Yes, but it wasn't allowed. The rules." "Whose rules?" "God's rules," Josiah shouted from behind them. "The rules of purity, the rules that keep women safe from the—" "Shut up," Brennan said quietly. Then, to Leora, "You're free now. Do you understand? You can leave any time you want." Leora started shaking. It began as a tremor and built into violent trembling. No, I can't. It's not safe out there. There's too much out there. Too much space. Too many people. I can't." She collapsed, hyperventilating. The FBI agent called for paramedics. It took 3 ambulances to transport all 7 women. Each one had a different reaction to being told they were free. Some cried, some screamed. One, Willa, didn't react at all, just stared blankly ahead. When the EMTs tried to take her outside, she fought them with surprising strength, scratching and biting. "No! Can't go out! The judgment! The corruption! No!" They had to sedate her. The men were arrested. Josiah, his 4 sons, 8 grandsons. Even Samuel, Leora's son, who'd imprisoned his own wife. As they led Josiah out in handcuffs, he was still preaching. "You're agents of Satan! You're destroying God's chosen! The women were protected. They were pure. You're condemning them to—" "You stole their lives," Brennan said. "You stole 34 years from that woman. You killed at least 2 others. You're going to prison, and I hope you rot there." They transported the women to East Tennessee State Medical Center in Johnson City. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the chief psychiatrist, examined them and felt like she was treating hostages from a war zone. "This is severe long-term trauma," she told her staff. "Decades of psychological imprisonment. They have agoraphobia so severe they can't tolerate open spaces. Some have catatonia. All have severe PTSD. This will take years of treatment, if treatment even works." Leora couldn't tolerate a room with a window. Any view of the outside triggered panic attacks. They put her in an interior room, painted to look like the wood walls she'd known. Even then, she spent most of her time facing the corner, rocking. When nurses tried to talk to her, she'd whisper, "Is it safe? Are the walls still there?" Willa, who'd been captive for 31 years, didn't speak at all. She sat motionless for days. When they finally got her to move, she'd only walk in small circles, the same pattern she'd walked inside the sanctuary. Her mind had broken completely. Temperance, 41 years old after 21 years of captivity, cried constantly. She couldn't stop. Tears just flowed like a wound that wouldn't close. The younger women, Opal, Ivy, Vera, had spent only 14 to 17 years imprisoned. They were damaged, but showed glimmers of recovery potential. Vera, the youngest at 23 after 3 years captive, was the only one who showed curiosity about the outside world. But even she couldn't handle being outside. A nurse walked her into the hospital courtyard. Vera stood at the door, gripping the frame, staring at the open sky. "I forgot how big it is," she whispered. "It's too big. I'll get lost in all that space." The trial began in September 1991. Federal Court, Eastern District of Tennessee, 14 defendants. The charges filled multiple pages: kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy, involuntary servitude, tampering with evidence, the bodies buried in the garden. The prosecution had 56 counts total. The courtroom was packed. News of the sanctuary case had exploded across America. A fundamentalist cult that had imprisoned women for decades in Appalachia? It was sensational. National news networks sent reporters. The courthouse needed extra security. The women couldn't testify in person. They were too traumatized. Instead, the prosecution played videotaped depositions. Leora's was the most heartbreaking. She sat in a dim room, the camera adjusted so the harsh lights wouldn't trigger her panic. The prosecutor's voice came from off-camera. "Mrs. Coldwell, can you describe your experience?" Long silence. "I was 18. They said I was getting married into a good family, religious family. I thought it would be better than living with my aunt who didn't want me. The first month was strange, but okay. Then I tried to leave. They wouldn't let me. Locked me in a cellar for days. I tried to escape again, same thing. Eventually I stopped trying. I had a baby. Then another. I raised them inside those walls, taught them that this was normal, taught my daughters they'd live the same way someday. I became part of the prison, part of the machine that imprisoned me." "Did you ever think you'd be free?" "No. I knew I'd die there. I'd accepted it. When the sheriff came, I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever been, because I'd forgotten how to be free." Freedom was scarier than captivity. In the courtroom, people wept openly. Josiah's defense was religious freedom. His lawyer, a fundamentalist himself who took the case pro bono, argued that the Coldwells had a First Amendment right to practice their religion. These women weren't prisoners, he argued. They were wives, living according to their faith. Restrictive? Yes, but religious communities have always had strict rules. The Amish limit their members' contact with the outside world. Cloistered nuns never leave their convents. This is no different. The prosecution destroyed this argument. Cloistered nuns choose that life, the U.S. attorney countered. They can leave any time. These women had no choice. They tried to escape. They were punished, imprisoned, terrorized. This wasn't faith. It was captivity. And even if it had started as faith, even if these women had initially consented to these restrictions, you cannot consent to be imprisoned. You cannot sign away your freedom. The law doesn't recognize such contracts. These women's rights were violated every single day for decades. Josiah testified in his own defense. Even at 74, even facing life in prison, he showed no doubt. "I saved those women," he said, his voice strong and clear. "The world out there is corrupt. Television, movies, magazines, all filth. Women working outside the home, abandoning their children, divorce, adultery, abortion, all accepted now. I created a sanctuary from that corruption. My women were pure, safe, happy." "Happy?" the prosecutor said softly. "Mrs. Coldwell, Leora, tried to escape multiple times. You locked her in a cellar. You call that happy?" "She was confused," Josiah replied. "The world had already corrupted her with false ideas about freedom. I had to correct that thinking, for her own good." "And the women who died? Delphine Hargrove, who stopped eating until she died? Nadine Kilpatrick, who bled to death in childbirth because you refused to call a doctor? Were they happy?" "God called them home," Josiah said calmly. "Their time was done." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came in November 1991. Federal judges have limited discretion with kidnapping charges, especially when violence is involved. Josiah Coldwell, 4 consecutive life sentences plus 60 years. He'd die in prison. His sons, Ezekiel, Tobias, and Silas, each got 3 life sentences plus 40 years. Micah, the youngest son who'd been less involved, got 25 years. The grandsons received varying sentences from 10 to 30 years depending on their level of participation. They sent Josiah to USP McCreary, a high-security federal prison in Kentucky. He was 74 years old. In prison, there's a hierarchy. Child abusers and rapists at the bottom. Josiah was classified as a sex offender. The kidnapping and imprisonment of women carries that designation. Other inmates didn't take kindly to that. He was beaten within his first week. Fractured ribs, broken nose. The guards pulled his attackers off but didn't rush to help him. It happened again. And again. Josiah was old, frail despite his rigid spine. He couldn't defend himself. 6 months into his sentence, he was found dead in his cell. Officially, heart attack. Unofficially, several inmates had helped him along. He was 75 years old. Ezekiel and Tobias suffered similar fates in different prisons. Federal inmates have ways of handling crimes against women. Ezekiel lost an eye in a beating. Tobias was stabbed but survived, spending 2 years in the prison hospital. Silas, the youngest of the brothers, managed better by keeping his head down and finding protection with a white supremacist gang. Micah served his time quietly and was released in 2016. Samuel, Leora's son, tried to kill himself in prison. Hanged himself with a bedsheet. They cut him down in time, but he'd been without oxygen long enough to suffer brain damage. He lived the rest of his sentence in the prison psychiatric ward, barely verbal. The psychologist's notes read, "Patient expresses extreme guilt, states, 'I did to my wife what my father did to my mother.' Shows signs of severe dissociative disorder. Prognosis, poor." The women remained institutionalized. Leora lived in the psychiatric facility for 4 years. She never went outside. Nurses tried multiple times to take her to the courtyard, but each attempt triggered such severe panic attacks that doctors worried she'd have a heart attack. She died in 1994 at age 56. Her heart simply stopped one night. She'd spent 34 years imprisoned and 4 years hospitalized. She never experienced freedom. Willa died in 1993 at 53. She never spoke again after her rescue, just faded away like a candle burning down. Temperance lived until 1999. She learned to walk in the hospital courtyard but couldn't go farther. Open streets, cars, crowds, they triggered massive anxiety attacks. She died of an aneurysm at 51. The younger women survived. Opal, Ivy, and Vera were transferred to a specialized treatment facility for trauma survivors. Vera adapted best. By 2000, she could go to grocery stores, though she still couldn't handle crowds. She met a man through a support group, another trauma survivor, and they married in 2002. She had a child, tried to build a normal life. But she had nightmares every night, the walls closing in, the gate that wouldn't open. Josiah's pale eyes watching her. Opal still lives in a group home. She's 68 now and can't handle being alone in open spaces. She goes to a sheltered workshop every day, does simple assembly work, returns to the group home at night. It's a routine, bounded and predictable, like the sanctuary but without the cruelty. She needs the walls, even now. Ivy learned to go to a nearby park, but only with a companion. She lives in assisted living, volunteers at a community center. She's functional, but limited. The years in captivity carved something out of her that never grew back. Caleb, the whistleblower, left Tennessee after the trial. He couldn't stay in a place where half the people called him a hero and half called him a family traitor. He moved to Portland, changed his last name, built a new life. He became a social worker, specializing in domestic abuse cases. He married, had 2 kids. He told his wife the whole story on their 5th anniversary. She cried. "You saved them," she said. "I was too late," he replied. 34 years too late. Every year on July 15th, the anniversary of the raid, he drives to Tennessee. There's a cemetery outside Monroe County where they buried Leora, Willa, and Temperance. Delphine and Nadine were never found, despite extensive searches of the compound grounds. Caleb brings flowers and stands in silence. He saved the women, but by the time help arrived, their lives were already gone. Freedom came too late to matter. In 2018, a documentary team reached out to him. They wanted to make a film about the sanctuary. Caleb agreed to an interview on one condition: his face wouldn't be shown. He sat in shadow, his voice altered, and told the story. "People ask me why I waited 2 years after leaving," he said. "Why didn't I go to police immediately? The truth is, I was scared. Scared of my family. Scared that no one would believe me. Scared of what would happen to me. And I was still half brainwashed. Part of me thought maybe grandfather was right. Maybe the women were safer inside. It took 2 years in the real world to understand how insane that was. 2 years while they suffered. That's on me." The documentary interviewed Vera, the only survivor willing to appear on camera. She was 51 years old, looked 70. Trauma ages you. "I was lucky," she said. "Only 3 years inside. For Leora, it was 34. She couldn't remember freedom. She'd been behind walls longer than she'd been free. How do you recover from that? You don't. You just survive." "Why didn't anyone notice?" the interviewer asked. "How did this happen in modern America?" Vera thought carefully. "Isolation. These mountains, you can disappear. Religious communities get left alone, First Amendment and all that. The brides came from far away, no family to search for them. And after a while, you stop fighting. You accept the cage. That's the worst part. You start to believe the lies, that you're protected, that the outside world really is dangerous, that this is God's will. Your mind breaks, and the broken pieces arrange themselves around the bars." The Coldwell compound was sold in 1995. A developer bought it, planning to turn it into a retreat center, but workers refused to stay there. They reported feeling watched, hearing sounds, women crying, footsteps in empty rooms. Eventually, the developer gave up and sold it to a church group who demolished everything except the main hall. They built a small chapel on the site with a memorial garden. 7 stones, each with a name: Leora, Delphine, Nadine, Willa, Temperance, and 2 blank stones for the daughters who died in infancy. The inscription reads, "In memory of the women of the sanctuary. May their suffering teach us that tradition is not sacred when it enslaves. Faith is not pure when it imprisons. And silence is complicity." Monroe County tried to forget. But some stories don't die. Students at the local high school do research projects on it. Journalists write retrospectives every decade. Sociologists and criminologists study it as an extreme case of cultic abuse and patriarchal violence. Religious scholars examine how fundamentalism can twist into tyranny, and 7 women, some dead, some barely alive, stand as proof that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like an old man with a white beard, quoting scripture, absolutely convinced he's doing God's work. Sometimes it looks like sons and grandsons who genuinely believed they were protecting their wives. Sometimes it looks like walls that claim to keep danger out, but actually keep prisoners in. Josiah Coldwell died believing he was righteous. His sons served their sentences, some repentant, some not. Caleb lives with guilt that therapy can't quite erase. The women who survived carry trauma that will last their remaining years. And in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, where secrets hide in every holler, people still talk about the sanctuary. A warning, a reminder, a story that refuses to be forgotten, because some horrors must be remembered so they're never repeated. 7 women, 34 years, 12-foot walls and a locked gate. A world shrunk to a handful of rooms, lives stolen in the name of purity, and silence that lasted 4 decades until one person found the courage to say, "This is wrong." Sometimes one voice is enough to break a system, but sometimes that voice comes too late. The women were rescued, but rescue isn't the same as salvation. Freedom came, but they'd forgotten how to be free. Justice was served, but justice can't give back stolen decades. In the end, the sanctuary case stands as evidence of humanity's capacity for cruelty disguised as care, for imprisonment masquerading as protection, for tyranny claiming divine sanction. And it reminds us that evil thrives not just in obvious villainy, but in certainty. The dangerous certainty that you know better than others how they should live, that your faith justifies their captivity, that your walls are for their own good. The gate is open now, has been for 32 years, but for those women, the walls never really came down. They live inside them still, prisoners of memory, captives of trauma, ghosts of the people they might have been if someone had noticed, someone had cared, someone had asked the right questions 30 years sooner. 7 women, 34 years, and a silence that should never have lasted so long.